So George Floyd is killed. 9-minute murder, give or take a few seconds. The public comes up in protests all over the United States, for that matter, all over the world. And all sorts of emphasis and focus gets put on the policing in the United States. We have 5% of the world's population, with 25% of that world's population of prisoners in our jails. That's abominable in and of itself. What is your society doing to create this many people that end up running afoul of your criminal justice system? That's a society problem. That's not necessarily an individual problem if you have that many people that are ending up in your jails. Beyond that point, cops kill 1,000 people a year. Well, that number is abominable when you look at one of our neighbors, the UK, and I think it was like 3. And so then you look at the killings, and either these cops are just perfect in their dispensation of force, or something is wrong with these numbers where you get 99% to walk and only a fraction of the 1% that is dealing with consequences get jail time. There's a problem with policing in this country. There's a societal problem that generates or that creates a system that creates people who run afoul of the law in this many respects. And some of this breaks down on racial lines, especially with the case of George Floyd. And this brought all sorts of racial issues that have basically just lingered there in the shadows, the elephant not necessarily being acknowledged, all of a sudden trounces the drapes. Well, in this very specific case, the country is trying to reconcile all sorts of racial issues in the context, oddly enough, of policing. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. It's just the call out of this was defund the police. Now, I bitched and moaned on this channel that defund the police is problematic because basically the problems, a lot of this has to do with poverty, and cops are thrown in to try to mitigate the issues associated with the poverty. And if you're only going to focus on one aspect of that, you're going to miss the large other aspect that's also problematic that the cops were being put there for in the first place. Now, the public, for the most part, understood this as being, to some degree, not necessarily getting rid of the cops, but more so trying to find other ways to deal with policing and issues of crime. But nevertheless, many of the people who were pushing for the defund the police stuff, well, in some areas, they got what they wanted. AOC in New York, they're going to cut the police force apparently by $1 billion. And because of all of the pressure and all of the emphasis put on cops and the way they do their jobs, especially in regards to the protests, when you could see cops beating, injuring, punching, kicking, tear gassing, pepper spraying human beings who basically in many respects were just staying there, meaning just standing. In the case where they beat up the older guy who was walking up in order to talk to them about something, or in the other case where they accosted a reporter, like all of these things were taking place in the context of policing and in a weird way legitimizing the very fact that the protests were taking place at all. That doesn't mean that cops are going to feel some kind of way about it, despite the fact that cops were being legitimately pointed to. New York has seen a 49% increase in retirements in regards to people who were on the police force who left. They didn't want to deal with the pressure, and if they can't flagrantly abuse the rights of citizens, then they don't want to necessarily do the job, or at the very least do the job now. They may come back to it later on when the pressure dies down. But if I can't kick the shit out of a person who's annoying me, then I don't want to do this job, and you guys are going to suffer for it. With this many people leaving the force, predictably, a spike in crime. Now, for AOC, who was one of the people who were pushing hard for the defund the police, she has to some degree, explain that. Well, you said you wanted to defund the police. They're going to cut it by $1 billion. You had all of these people leaving the force, and now you have a spike in crime. Why? And what you're going to hear is ideology that has somewhat of a gap between the ideological belief versus the realistic outcome. At the very least, it seems that way, only because of the way she's trying to explain it. And people were taking shots at her over this particular video, even though AOC was right, she just couldn't necessarily get the explanation down in a way that made the connection between the increase in crime and so forth as a result of this issue. Part and parcel to it, though, is because, like I said, if you're going to defund the police, you need to do it organically by dealing with the issues associated with poverty that incentivize crime in the first place. You can go look back at my videos. I kept saying this. I would accept defund the police as a slogan if that means people basically going out and pushing and everything else. But I think it's too diminutive for the moment with all of the energy that was expended on this issue. Nevertheless, she does her best to explain it, and people are taking shots at her saying this is what it sounds like when you open one poli-sci book, it doesn't necessarily open up another one. We're going to help her out. AOC struggles to explain why there's a jump in crime in New York after the defund the police thing, $1 billion apparently, de Blasio, was put through. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This content is brought to you by you, and I appreciate you the opportunity to do it. We're going to have a contributor appreciation tomorrow. My wife, for whatever reason, took tomorrow off, so we're going to have contributor appreciation. So today, I just want to get a few shows in. And of course, Monday through Friday, fault lines, 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. Eastern. You can hear myself and Shane Stranahan do the news with our perspectives on what that news is. AOC is struggling here, and people are taking shots at her for this. Washington Examiner even put it in their Twitter feed because they think that it's basically her struggling. It sounds like she's struggling, but she is hitting on something that is somewhat true. Let's take a look at AOC do her best to explain uptick in crime in lieu of all of the people of the cops. 49% increase in retirements.
So why is this uptick in crime happening? Well, let's think about it. Do we think this has to do with the fact that there's record unemployment in the United States right now? The fact that people are at a level of economic desperation that we have not seen since the Great Recession? Maybe this has to do with the fact that people aren't paying their rent and are scared to pay their rent. And so they go out and they need to feed their child and they don't have money. So you maybe have to, they're put in a position where they feel like they either need to shoplift some bread or go hungry that night. Maybe it's the fact that unemployment provisions have not been given to everyone. Maybe it's because of the fact that some people still haven't gotten their stimulus checks yet. And so why is this uptick in crime happening? Well, let's think.
Basically, an uptick in violent crime, and she's trying to attribute it to ideological lines, meaning break this down into from the standpoint of an issue of class and lack and people not necessarily having access to the things that they need. The problem is some of these were murders, or much of this was violent crime. Now here's the catch. People spend their lives in this absolute school of reality. Whatever and however you grew up, from the time that you were born to the time you are right now, you are basically a reflection of the things that you've experienced and the world that was around you. And those experiences are far more influential, and your way of pursuing the world and the beliefs and the way that the world is structured are far more influential than anything that someone will tell you as you grow up, or for that matter, of what your society will try to get you to believe, especially when those people are free of lack. They have the things that they need. They're rich. It's clear that they're rich, and you are suffering through it. Living in that particular situation, you're going to have a certain percentage of people, just logically, that take a cost-benefit ratio in regards to what they want to get and what they believe they need, or for that matter, what they believe they deserve, in comparison to their ability to get it, juxtaposed against the crime and what will happen to them. Meaning, all crime is a cost-benefit analysis of based on what do I need, what do I want, and what is the chance of me getting caught, and what are the consequences if I get caught. That's crime in a nutshell. Now, what AOC is trying to explain is how that factor of cost-benefit risk analysis goes into the notion of people who commit crime, even violent crime. Now, it has been pretty clear through studies that crime increases the level of inequality as inequality increases. That gets worse when it's more ostentatious displays of wealth, meaning when it becomes clear that an aspect of your society has a huge amount of wealth and that wealth is being on display and used, the amount of violent crime in the society goes up. This has been demonstrated through studies for a while. Now, if that's true, and the reality to which you've lived has been ensconced by lack, there's going to be a certain probability and percentage of people who come away with an assessment that get rich or die trying is the way to live life. And that what they think they need, what they think they want, particularly in contrast to what they don't necessarily have, the risk associated with it is less. Now, if you were brought up in a system or society where you had your needs met as you cradled to however you got older, your parents and everything else, for the most part, had the ability to supply you with what you needed. There wasn't a situation where you're sitting at home with no lights on or sitting eating mayonnaise sandwiches or anything like that. You had your needs met. And in having your needs met, you also had the determination of what school you wanted to go to. If you were ever ill, you can go to the doctor. Nobody was complaining about bills or illness. Not necessarily that you guys were rich, but you had the things that you needed. You grew up in that context. Tell me, is your propensity for crime higher or less? If the world around you, you're not necessarily seeing lack, you don't necessarily see people who are going without, you yourself are not going without, and you have all sorts of decision space to make choices where cost doesn't necessarily seem to be a factor or dig into you in a way that it would dig into others. If that is your world, is your propensity cost-benefit analysis for crime higher or lower? Meaning, what do you lose in the context of committing a crime versus what do you gain? And if what you lose is far more significant, then your propensity for crime is probably going to be less. By the same token, if you grew up in a world where that's not true, your propensity for crime might be more. It's not necessarily that it's an absolute. It doesn't have to be an absolute. You only need to see a certain percentage in order to see a variance in the various societies or the various communities in the United States. You tell me, does the propensity to crime go up or go down when cops are being basically, when a microscope is being put on the way cops do their job? And especially when you also know that a large number of people left the force. Well, clearly, the propensity for crime in that situation will go up because the thought will be that cops are not necessarily focused on you. They're focused on other things, not to mention the lack of people who are going to be monitoring particular areas. Your propensity for crime will probably go up. The emphasis on it, the cost-benefit analysis, the risk assessment changes. Under that idea of crime, then it is the most natural thing in the world for when these cops leave and for the focus to be put on the cops, for there to be some level of a response. But consider for the moment, it would be ludicrous to not see a response. If you were 300 pounds and you started eating salads, are you going to see changes over the course of 2 weeks? Are you still going to get hunger pains? Yes. Does it mean that your choice in the things that you've decided to do are wrong? No, it does not. It just means that your history sticks to itself, and there are aspects of it that is trying to pull you back into it. The getting rid of $1 billion is nice, but again, the issue becomes organically getting rid of the cops. By doing so, by getting rid of poverty. And if you're only going to deal with one aspect, meaning the cops, then you're going to have consequences. Hence, spiking crime. Now, AOC is trying to explain that here, and she's not particularly doing a great job trying to explain it. No reality or no policy is going to change this stuff overnight. And fact of the matter is, that doesn't necessarily make it wrong. It just means that the policy will have consequences in the beginning of you changing over to something that's dramatically different. The problem in this case is the issue here, in many respects, is poverty and whether or not crime is incentivized within the context of that poverty. And if you're not going to do anything about one aspect of that, the poverty, and you're only going to focus on the cops, you're going to miss the boat and have consequences. Hence this. Look, AOC is not entirely wrong here. And yeah, AOC is not necessarily wrong here. Cops kill 1,000 people a year. That's a problem. Cops flagrantly abuse authority. That's a problem. But reality doesn't necessarily come in these kind of clear-cut one way or the other ways. There are often gradations of that stuff. And by definition, putting an emphasis on the cops and having people look at policing the police, well, you will have people who think that they can get away with more than what they could have potentially got away with before. AOC is having a hard time explaining that. AOC may not be able to hit it directly And her bringing up issues of ideology to some degree may fall flat to some people as they listen to it. But again, these are studies that do make the connection between violent crime versus inequality. And the inequality that is taking place now with people being potentially thrown out of their homes, or for that matter, people not necessarily even having money to make ends meet, it does and will create income inequality, just as it goes. So she's not entirely wrong. It's that she's just not necessarily hitting it directly. Yeah, look, there is no reason for our society, or for that matter, the world, to be impoverished. We have all sorts of ingenuity that could be put to the ends of eliminating poverty from this planet, let alone from our country. We choose not to do those things. And in lieu of choosing not to do those things, we throw in cops, as if cops is somehow going to mitigate the fact that the crime will be basically incentivized by the conditions to which the people grow up in. We are creating a world that's creating a certain point of view. And we're acting as if the point of view is somewhat separate and distinct from the world to which allowed that point of view to generate. If you want to change how people engage this world, then you need to change the conditions to which they grow up in. That is not something that happens overnight. It's farcical to believe that a person will be brought up in a certain community that gives certain incentives and certain drives and certain perspectives of the world, and that overnight changing that will somehow change him or change her. It will not. You're talking about somewhat of a generational shift of a conscious, deliberative effort to eliminate poverty from your country. And the fact of the matter is, Jeff Bezos could do it by himself. That's how much money Jeff Bezos has. So this notion that we can't do it, we choose not to do it. And cops are basically the poor that are paid to police the other poor. If we are going to change that, we need to get to the root of that. And the root of that is ensuring that people have the things that they need, where they don't necessarily find themselves in these horrible, grimy circumstances where some of the choices that they make, or the rationality of the world that they basically come away with, is that this is get rich, die trying, and a certain alienation from the society itself, in which case they rebel against the society. That's not most. In fact, that's a small percentage, but it only needs to be a small percentage for you to get a spike in crime. I'll leave this here. I don't want to belabor the point. Like, share, and subscribe. Jesus, thank you, Jesus. I keep wanting to call you Jesus, but that's okay. Thanks all. But she did try. Points for trying. Also, one more thing. Don't injure people for their increased analysis of the world. Like, her ideology is coming to grips with reality of some degree. And the reality is that the cops were a rational response to not wanting to deal with the poverty that was in those various areas. Well, if that's a rational response for not wanting to deal with poverty, and you get rid of the cops or try to put pressure on the cops, what's going to be the other side effect of that? Her understanding of this and her ability to explain it is just evolving because she's a person. It's not for, we don't have to necessarily take the piss out of her for every time she doesn't necessarily get it explicitly right. I think the thing is, I will take the piss out of her, though, if she's taking a position that's BS. But her position here is not necessarily BS. She's just having a harder time to reconcile the ideology of issues of class with what is taking place in regards to the streets. It just needs to be expanded slightly. But I'll leave it here. Like, share, and subscribe.